pragmatism. The secularization of the Christian churches has been a great concern.
Yes.
You've written quite a lot on it. Is it possible to, in effect, to talk about a kind of map of the contemporary world in terms of the centrality or marginality of religion in it?
Well, it's possible certainly to divide the world up into different spheres. You'll find one story being told in Scandinavia, another story being told in the Mediterranean countries, another story being told in Bulgaria and Russia. Mm-hmm. And the thing is to try and pick out what it is that will distinguish the Russian, Eastern European pattern from the Latin pattern, and from, if you like, the Anglo-Saxon ones.
Is it possible to see patterns?
Yes, I think it is. That, for example, what happens in Scandinavia is very, very different from what happens in Italy and in France. And again, both of those are very, very, very different from what happens in America. And again, those are different from what would happen in Ireland and in Poland, for example. It's interesting, actually, that the Pope, in a way, sort of vindicated one of my categories by choosing Ireland and Poland for his first visits, because the Ireland and Poland belong together within this within the kind of categorizations I proposed. I mean, if I were to take Ireland and Poland just to start with, these belong to a group of cultures and subcultures that have the highest practice in Europe. Let's say around about 85% in Poland and perhaps 90 plus in Ireland. And one asks, what is the common element that has informed that kind of culture where practice is very high? And it is where for a long period the Catholic Church has had to double for the political identity of the people. It has actually had to carry the culture and the political identity of the people against outside forces. In the case of Poland, either Germany or Russia. In the case of Ireland, England. Now, it's interesting to go through the rest of Europe, finding other places that have a similar sort of histories. For example, the Basque Country, with all this trouble at the present time, has always defined itself as being dominated by Madrid, being a distinctive culture with a distinctive for example, the Basque Country, with all this trouble at the present time, has always defined itself as being dominated by Madrid, being a distinctive culture with a distinctive language, and it has seen Madrid actually as a secular centre dominating the religious Basques. So now that has about 85% practice. The same with Brittany vis-a-vis Paris. You know, there they are, the French dominating the Breton culture. Or Croatia vis-a-vis Belgrade at the present time, or Slovakia vis-a-vis Prague. Again, very high practice. Now one can, or Flanders, for example, seeing the French, the secular French, as sitting on top of Flemish. So now all these have the highest. All these are the areas of high practice in Europe. So it's fascinating to say, well, here are a whole set of cultures where religion and identity run together. So they form a kind of category, and one can see the effects of this, of course, in contemporary politics. The kind of intense feelings that are bred by this. So that if you go into a Flemish restaurant and the waiter comes up to you and speaks in French, there's a sense of insult. He is actually conveying the sense of domination that the Flemish have had. So, and I don't need to speak about the situation in Ireland at the present time to emphasise that occurs also in Ireland. But you have a quite very, very different situation if you turn to the places where there's lowest practice. The lowest practice in Europe is found in the Scandinavian countries. I looked at the Scandinavian countries and I was quite fascinated because there you would find that only about 4% of the population is in church on a Sunday. What's absolutely fascinating is that the number of people that are confirmed who are officially inside the church and are happy to call themselves Lutherans runs at the level of about 90%. So there's something very odd going on, in other words, where people are happy to identify themselves as in some sense belonging to the institution, but just don't feel it appropriate to go to it. Now that happens often where you've had a long and fairly settled democratic tradition, and where the sense of external domination doesn't exist, so people don't need, as it were, to repair to their altars and say, here are our ancestral gods. There's no need to do that at all. They can take all those things for granted. And so in effect you get, slowly the altars become deserted, and what you're left with is the shell of identification. I mean, do you see the kind of distinctions that one gets between one kind of culture and another?
The moment you're concerned about the within the Anglican Church,
yes.
the possible disappearance
yes.
of the classical forms. What is the situation? What is happening?
Well, what is happening is that there is an attempt to do away with the resonant forms and all the range of meanings associated with them, in favour of what you might call a utility kit kind of language that is believed to be connected with the language of the people. My own view is it's got absolutely nothing to do with the language of the people at all, that the kind of language used is in fact just ordinary, what you might call the official grammar of the middle classes on their best platform behaviour and nothing more. And that what a man would, that indeed what men speak in their own context has never got into the church's liturgy. I mean, how people speak, for example, in Walsall, or how they speak in County Durham, that would be the language of the people, and there's been no attempt to do that. It'd be extremely interesting to see it done, actually.
But what about the people who would say that the classical forms and language didn't have a whole lot of meaning for them?
Oh yes, there are a very large number of people who...
Oh, because you're not against ruling, you're for having both, really.
Yes, for having... I think it's excellent to try to see what one can do in modern linguistic forms. It's just a pity that it's done by committees that have got not the slightest idea how to do it. That they don't call on the genius that's available within, well, let's say some contemporary poets. I mean, it would have been marvellous if W.H. Auden, for example, had constructed a taut, hard-wearing, powerful modern liturgy. No doubt the theologians would have wanted to check it for accuracy, if you like. But all they have done actually is to produce a sort of castrated utilitarian form of English that has no power, resonance, or anything else.
Perhaps it's a difficult question to answer off the top of your head, but can you give me an example of the old and the new side by side? Well,
the Te Deum, for example, we praise thee, O God, we acknowledge thee to be the Lord, all the earth doth worship thee, the Father everlasting, which is then replaced by, you are God, we praise you, which informs God who he is, and then about what one the appropriate activity is for us in response. But it seems to me that the comparison between those two is just fantastic, you know. But it occurs all through every one that Catholics, of course, will know very well is, Lord be with you and with thy spirit, which is that then becomes and also with you, which many people want to add, and with Nobson too. You know, it's got that kind of ridiculous comic effect which is added in.
I've noticed over the years that you've been very hard on what you call trendy clerics. I've seen many magazine articles with your name on them, as if they've been a particular concern of yours.
I think that can be a bit misunderstood. In an article which I did an encounter in January, I in fact said a lot of things which were by way of praise of the World Council of Churches. For example, I thought that its attitudes to race and to poverty were commendable. What I fear is that there is a kind of inversion of the old attitudes, so that you've almost got a kind of dogma standing on its head, so that one almost gets the belief that because white men in the past have done so many wrong things, it follows that no black man in the present can ever do anything that is wrong. Now, there again, I've illustrated my capacity for caricature, but there is that kind of automatic standing on one's head that I think does infect the attitude of the WCC. Again, it's true that that it would be a very naive person that supposed that all good resided in Western democracies and all bad was to be located in Eastern Europe. But the capacity of the World Council of Churches to lambast Western countries, because of course the Western countries allow themselves to be lambasted, and the capacity of the WCC not to lambast Eastern Europe, because after all Eastern Europe is in the position to lambast you more than you are to lambast them. This kind of moral selectivity, I think, makes people very irritated with the World Council of Churches and inclined to see it as in fact a kind of political cockpit in which operated by somewhat maybe somewhat naive clergymen. So there is, if you like, on the one hand good things, fundamental attitudes about race and poverty, but also a moral selectivity that does irritate one quite considerably.
I've heard the point made that the vicar is sometimes a figure of fun, the Catholic priest rarely. Why do you think that is? The different kind of...
Well, that's a complicated one, but I would have thought that probably the Catholic priest came from a very similar kind of cultural background as those that he's ministering to, that he lies quite close to the people, that he and they see him as one of themselves. Whereas in the Church of England there has been, since the 18th century anyway, an association of the clergy with squire and doctor and so on, so that, and he has had a kind of a university culture which has elicited a mixture of admiration and distance. That's to say, some people have felt respect for a man of education, but they've also seen him as part of a paternalistic structure in the village and in the countryside, and therefore not somebody with whom they are naturally allied. So now, one way of getting back at people with whom one is not naturally allied is to construct cardboard versions of them, comic versions of them. And but against that, it has to be added that if you look at the results of polls, although people do have these ideas about naughty vicars and comic vicars, they also tell the pollsters that they do very much respect the clergy. So you've got a kind of ambivalence.
Can I ask you finally to look into the future a bit for us? It's sometimes said that we're going to see the demise of, or indeed Catholicism, or various forms of Christianity. The point has been made by the end of the century.
Yes.
What's your view of that kind of thing?
Well, sociologists aren't very good at prediction. In fact, they have a capacity of explaining things retrospectively rather than prospectively. But I suppose a historical sensibility would lead one to be very wary about any funeral rites read over the body of the Catholic Church, particularly when one considers that, say, in the 15th century you can see the Church absolutely riddled with corruption. You can see whole areas of Europe where there is very little serious practice, very little knowledge of Christian doctrine and so on. You can come to the English 18th century. You can find here situations where perhaps only 5% of the population in even places like Oxfordshire make their Easter communion. In other words, you can trace all kinds of periods and situations in the life of the churches where there has been laxity, lassitude, lack of knowledge, and a general scepticism about the institution, and yet subsequently one's found that the institution recovers. So that's a general approach. What I do feel about the Catholic Church is that it has a unique capacity to combine universality with particularity, and to combine, if you like, authority in theory with flexibility in practice. Now these two things give it enormous survival power, and I feel that the present Pope has a very nice sense of exactly where that balance between the demands of the universal church and the particular situation in particular cultures is, that he understands that balance very well, and that he understands that authority is an essential element in all institutions, that some are covert and some are overt, but it'll always be there, and that he understands this balance between the exercise of authority and yet giving all kinds of local hierarchies the right to respond to their own context. So I'm not actually very pessimistic about the future of the Catholic Church.
David Martin, Professor of Sociology at the London School of Economics, whose particular field of expertise is the sociology of religion. That concludes this edition of The Church in Action. From me, goodbye.